It's once again everyone's favorite time of the year. The World Economic Forum is currently holding their annual meeting over in Davos, Switzerland. This is, of course, the meeting wherein the world's elites come together on both their private jets and their giant motorcades in order to mingle, in order to plan out the future, and also, ironically, in order to lay the groundwork for reducing the world's carbon footprint. And the beauty of this particular event, of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, is that this is where, very often, the quiet part is said out loud. That's because even though at this event most of the real discussions still happen behind closed doors, well, the public-facing speeches and the panel discussions that are had, well, they do still allow common plebes, like you and me, to get a small glimpse into what the global elites, who hold many of the levers of power within our societies, are planning for the future. Now, in previous years, we've gotten quite a few interesting tidbits on what these plans look like. Things like tracking the carbon footprint of each individual person using their credit card, placing little microchips inside of medicine in order to track whether a patient took it or not in order to increase compliance, implanting smartphones into people's bodies. These are the types of innovative ideas that are floated each year at the World Economic Forum. And this year, in 2023, well, it appears that things are going in the very same direction, evidenced by Mr. Klaus Schwab himself, the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum.
Can you imagine that in 10 years when we are sitting here, we have an implant in our brains, and I can immediately feel, because you all will have implants, and we measure your brain waves, and I can immediately tell you how the people react, or I can feel how the people react to your answers. Is it imaginable?
Furthermore, within just several hours of this year's event kicking off, we were treated to Mr. John Kerry giving us his thoughts on what the event can accomplish. Take a listen.
And when you stop and think about it, it's pretty extraordinary that we, select group of human beings, because of whatever touched us at some point in our lives, are able to sit in a room and come together and actually talk about saving the planet. I mean, it's so almost extraterrestrial.
And of course, we can't forget Mr. Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain, who just a few days ago was talking about the need to track whether people were vaccinated or not well into the future. Take a listen.
You need to know who's been vaccinated and who hasn't been. Some of the vaccines that will come on down the line will be multiple. There'll be multiple shots. So you've got to have, for reasons to do with the healthcare more generally, but certainly for a pandemic or for vaccines, you've got to have a proper digital infrastructure. And many countries don't have that. In fact, most countries don't have that.
And so, with all of that in mind, one of the main topics that will be discussed at this year's World Economic Forum is the topic of ESG, which stands for Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance. And while a sympathetic interpretation of ESG is that it forces companies to be more inclusive, more diverse, and perhaps more environmentally friendly, well, there is another way to look at it, which is that it's actually a way for these Davos individuals who share in this ideology to force their agenda upon other nations. They use the business sector when they can't achieve their aims through normal political channels. Now, I myself, probably just like many of you watching this video, I'm still waiting for my invitation to the World Economic Forum to arrive by mail. I'm sure it's just running a bit late. And so in lieu of that, today we're joined by Mr. Kevin Stocklin. He's a financial reporter for the Epoch Times as well as a film producer, with his most recent project being the Shadow State documentary. And he broke down for us the World Economic Forum's agenda for this year, how it connects to ESG, and what it actually means in practical terms for you and me. And so smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and take a listen.
Exactly. So one of the hallmarks of the ESG movement is the ability to use corporations to do what the government cannot legally do. So I can give you some examples of this. It is illegal, for example, for the U.S. government to create a database of firearms owners in the United States. Well, they've been able to get MasterCard and Visa and American Express to set up merchant category codes to track purchases. So in this way, they're able to follow any purchases that Americans might make in a gun shop or a sporting goods store that sells guns. You are not allowed to censor speech. That's something the federal government can't do, but they're able to get Twitter to do it. And all of that scandal is now coming out to light, how the FBI may well have colluded with Twitter to censor political speech leading up to the 2020 election campaign. So there are a number of ways that they've been able to use corporations to do what the government is prohibited from doing according to our Constitution.
Yeah, and you mentioned the courts and sort of American traditional values, which is something I'm kind of really keeping front of mind as I watched the WEF this year, because, for instance, you had the I believe it was a member of the European Parliament from Czechia, from the Czech Republic, coming out and saying something along the lines of, well, the U.S. is also going to implement anti-hate speech laws in the near future. And when I was watching that, I'm thinking, well, either she knows something I don't, or she doesn't understand the American legal system, because we have a very strong First Amendment protections. And so with this ESG movement, do you believe that it sort of squares with the U.S. Constitution and the laws we have in the books and the sort of the ethos of the American way, or is it because they're using the business sector rather than politics? It sort of doesn't matter because businesses, don't necessarily have to abide by the Constitution in the same way that, let's say, the government does.
I would say that the United States and the U.S. Constitution is by far the biggest problem for the WEF and the ESG movement. It's not just that we guarantee rights such as free speech and things like that. It is also that we have laws against a lot of the things that the ESG movement is trying to do. For example, we have an antitrust law that says it is illegal for companies to collude against other companies or other industries. What's a better example of corporate collusion than getting together once a year in Davos and signing a pledge that you're going to take out the oil and gas industry? We have civil rights laws that says that a lot of the components of the social justice part of ESG are illegal. You cannot discriminate. You cannot set quotas against people on the basis of race or gender or anything else. So these laws are huge problems. In addition, our whole system of federalism, which gives rights to the states and limits the power of the federal government, is an enormous problem for the WEF because they try to leverage national governments to force these policies on people, whether it's bans on internal combustion engines or bans on hate speech and this sort of a thing. So right now, I think when they look at their number one problem, it's the United States and our traditions and our legal system and our Constitution.
For the audience members who either have never heard of it before or maybe have just on the periphery heard this concept of ESG, can you sort of explain what it is from sort of a general 50,000 view perspective?
Sure. ESG is two things. It's an ideology and it's an industry. So as an ideology, it's environmental, social governance. It's an umbrella term for climate change, social justice, racial justice. They even include things like gun control and abortion rights. So that's the ideology. As an industry, it has been able to amass about $55 trillion worth of assets through asset management, and they are able to, with kind of Wall Street at the center, using these assets to control most of the corporate world in America today, and to get them in line with this agenda.
Wow. And based on what you just described, it seems to be that the ESG agenda is perfectly in line with what Klaus Schwab has been describing as the World Economic Forum's agenda of sort of shifting away from a shareholder type of capitalism to what he describes as a stakeholder type of capitalism. So I know on the surface that might even sound good. Can you sort of maybe speak to someone who is sympathetic to that view and thinks, hey, that actually sounds like a good idea? Can you sort of play it out? Like, what would that look like in practice if this was actually implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. So ESG is the business component of this ideology, and the idea of stakeholder capitalism. Traditionally, companies they're owned by shareholders, and they're supposed to generate maximum returns for shareholders. They do this by creating superior products or superior services that people want. What the ESG movement has done is basically said, well, we can leverage these companies and we can co-opt them to following an ideology outside of serving shareholders. So stakeholders do include shareholders, apparently, but more importantly, they include things like the community and the environment and the earth. And so the standards that used to be applied to CEOs that were monetary and financial standards, quantitative standards about your performance and profitability and increasing customers and all these sort of things, that can take a backseat now to your ESG rating as a company, and how well you are performing under social justice goals, what you're doing to save the environment. And we have a whole industry that's now arisen, the whole ESG rating industry that rates companies. It even rates countries. It rates U.S. states according to how compliant they are with the ESG ideology. So it's redirecting the whole purpose of companies and our economy towards following ideology versus serving customers.
Wow. In a practical sense, so you said it rates them. Is there an actual like number figure, like from 0 to 100, that you actually kind of fall on? Is that the case?
There are quite a few different rating agencies that have gotten into this business. But yeah, is as with general corporate ratings, you AAA, single A, triple B, or good, needs improvement. There's a whole spectrum. But they basically are coming up with criteria to rate companies according to how compliant they are. One of the goals of the WEF during this session is to really codify that and get that to be uniform among all the rating agencies. And that makes it easier for them to track who's actually complying.
And what is the incentive of these giant institutions like BlackRock to actually comply and go ahead and care about the ESG ratings? Because I can imagine they either believe themselves in this ideology and therefore they're implementing it, or is it like pressure from the media or from other people in the business world, putting pressure on them to implement ESG and or to care about it? Is that how it works?
It's kind of both at the same time. So there are the true believers, and then there are the people that have just kind of been bought off. So there are a number of people whose jobs now depend on this industry. It's the rating agencies, it's the lawyers, it's the consultants, it's the accountants that are all focusing on ESG, and the asset managers. Don't forget that they earn higher fees on ESG funds than they earn on, say, index funds, which are, passive, unmanaged funds. So there's certainly an economic interest. And then there are the true believers who go along with this as well. But BlackRock is a fascinating case because there is a revolving door between BlackRock and the Biden administration. People move from BlackRock to the Biden administration. They take senior positions. They come out of the Biden administration. The spokesperson for BlackRock right now was straight out of the Biden administration, just started working for BlackRock a few months ago. When we did our COVID bailouts, who was in charge of the distribution of some of those funds? It was BlackRock. And BlackRock just announced a new partnership with Ukraine to handle some of the funds that are being sent there. So there is this very much of a devil's bargain that's now going on between Wall Street and the federal government. And I think what the federal government is letting these banks know is that if you comply, if you play ball, if you go along with this agenda and help us, then we're going to be easier on you. And we can see that as well with the tech companies, right? All the actions that Twitter and Facebook and YouTube are taking to censor people who don't go along with the government agenda, they are now granted these monopoly positions, and the government's willing to look the other way when they engage in monopolistic behavior.
Can you give us an example of what a company or a corporation can do to increase their ESG score?
Sure. So we could take a look at the Disney Corporation, for example. Disney Corporation decided they were going to go to war with the state of Florida over a parents' rights bill. They decided that they were going to introduce more sexualized content into their media that is apparently designed for families and children. You could look at Delta Airlines, you could look at Coca-Cola and Major League Baseball fighting the state of Georgia's law that requires voter ID. Now, none of this has anything to do with the business or flying customers around or serving them fuzzy drinks. All of it has to do with complying with their ESG scores. You're looking at banks that are taking a firearms industry. PayPal cannot be used anymore to purchase guns or ammunition. None of this has anything to do with profitability. It has everything to do with following the WEF and the ESG agenda.
So Kevin, are you saying that those firms, the rating firms, they look at, let's say, a company like Disney, and they take into account, well, on the on the bill that was passing through the state legislature in Florida, they fought back against it, and therefore will increase their ESG score because they were in compliance with that sort of part of the agenda. Is that how it works?
Yeah, so that's the social justice component of ESG, and they will certainly get high marks for that.
Mm-hmm. So high marks, like an actual mark, like an 8 out of 10 or something like that, or an A+ or an A-.
Exactly. So that's what the scores are looking at is what are you doing to further social justice and racial justice, et cetera? What are you doing to reduce carbon footprints? And what are you doing to, for example, set quotas on hiring or on board members? How many of them how many of the seats are reserved for minorities or women and this sort of thing? That's all part of the ESG agenda.
From sort of a more practical perspective, let's say you own a small window installation company in Ohio, or you're a farmer in Minnesota, or you own a deli in New York. How will this ESG agenda affect you if you are just a small business owner?
Sure. Well, there's two ways that would affect you. The one is specifically, so for example, one of the things that the Biden administration has done to enforce ESG in the United States, the Securities Exchange Commission is now requiring that all listed companies report their CO2 emissions, and not only of their own company, but of their customers and their suppliers. Well, if you are Nestle, you have several 100,000 farmers that supply you with food for your products. So now all of these farmers are going to have to produce audited statements annually of their CO2 emissions, as well as their plans to reduce them. This is not something that your average farmer is able to afford. The second way that this movement affects people is what they pay. So we are all paying huge increases for fuel and for food because of the WEF and the ESG's war on the fossil fuel industry. So we've created an artificial shortage. It's not that there's any shortage of gasoline or natural gas in the world. It's that we've created an artificial shortage on extracting and refining because of this movement. It's driven prices through the roof, and it's gone through the entire economy. It affects manufacturing, transportation. Farmers rely on diesel fuel. They also rely on fertilizer. More than 3 billion people on this earth rely on synthetic fertilizer for food. That's a derivative of natural gas. So this is a period in the last couple of years when the effects of these policies and this agenda have hit home for everyone.
Wow. So is it the case that, let's say you're a farmer and you, let's say, grow potatoes in Idaho that you then want to sell to a big corporation like, let's say, McDonald's, right? And so since McDonald's is publicly traded, they need to now, with this new SEC regulation, have the CO2 numbers for not only themselves, but all their different partners, all the different businesses that they do business with. Meaning that if you're a farmer who sells to McDonald's, even though you want nothing to do with this agenda, now you are being forced to do this reporting. Otherwise, you lose one of your biggest clients, McDonald's. Is that sort of how it works?
That's correct. And what we're seeing is that, the large corporate farms don't have so much of a problem with this. They can afford to do this, but the small family farms are really struggling. At the same time, we're seeing investment funds buy up farmland throughout the United States. And who is the biggest owner of farmland in the United States today? It's Bill Gates through a number of his shell companies and other organizations. So it looks like a concerted effort to put family farmers out of business. As you well know as well, there's all sorts of legislation coming out in the Netherlands to really crack down on animal farming and try to force cattle farmers out of business. We saw Sri Lanka try to ban synthetic fertilizers, and we saw the devastating effects that it had on those people.
Yeah. Kevin, let me ask you, there seems to be a pushback against ESG as more people are sort of waking up to what it actually is. Your documentary came out, educated a lot of people. There was a great interview on Joe Rogan that went viral, that educated a lot of people on it. And more states are now starting to actually fight back against corporations and funds that have ESG as one of their components. But within the World Economic Forum, are they actually taking that criticism to heart? Are they maybe softening some of their pushes, or are they getting even more aggressive and trying to push things through before, let's say, more states fight back?
The strategy this year seems to be doubling down to try to, the theme of this year's WEF is cooperation in a fragmented world. And I think what that means is trying to get everybody back on board with this agenda and regroup. But there is no effort whatsoever to back off on these policies. In fact, they've identified climate change as the #1 threat to the Earth over the next 10 years. And so what they're trying to do is get everybody to really double down on taking out the fossil fuel industry and moving towards wind and solar.
Wow, and this ESG agenda is sort of the vehicle that they're using to make that happen.
Very much so. Now, it'll be interesting because, as you said, there is a tremendous amount of pushback against ESG. They say that this is the new version of CRT, that people, suddenly have learned what it is. They don't like it, and they're rebelling against it. And one of the themes of the WEF is why is there all this dissent? We must stop this dissent, that all these different opinions in the world. We don't like this. ESG is not going away. There's too many vested interests in it, but I could see in 2023 there being a rebranding of it. And just like the WEF suddenly said, oh, the Great Reset is nothing that we ever mentioned, even though they mentioned it 2 years ago, that was one of their themes. I think we may see people saying ESG we're not doing that anymore. But I think it's just going to be a rebranding of the same policies.
Now, if you'd like to check out Kevin's awesome documentary, The Shadow State, which goes much, much, much deeper into exposing, you can say, this ESG agenda, well, you can find it over on epoktv, our awesome no censorship video platform. That is, by the way, the same video platform that is notably not endorsed by the World Economic Forum. We're still waiting for their endorsement letter. It's probably just lost in the mail, just like my invitation to their annual event. Regardless, if you'd like to check out their documentary, the link will be right there at the very top of the description box. I hope you check it out. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.